Okay, it looks like we are live. So it's my pleasure to welcome you all here to this public information meeting on our budget. And this is an opportunity to learn more about the budget and for us to receive your feedback and answer questions. It is a glorious, glorious day in Lekwungen territory here, and the Greater Victoria School District wishes to acknowledge and recognize the Esquimalt and Songhees nations on whose traditional territories we live, we learn, and we do our work. As an uninvited settler on these lands, I am never more grateful than I am on a spring evening like this with the sun shining. To the people who've maintained these beautiful lands since time immemorial. I feel a great debt to their wisdom and resilience. And yeah, I invite all of you to take a moment to reflect upon your relationship with the lands you're on and your gratitude in that connection, hopefully. And good, okay, I think we've got 114 people on, and I'm sure that'll change as we go along. I'm going to welcome our Secretary Treasurer Kim Morris to take over the proverbial reins here and help us with our meeting. But on behalf of the board, I'm Jordan Waters, I'm the board chair, and I know we've got most of our trustees are here as well listening, and that's what we're going to be doing, is sort of taking a step back and taking everything in from all of you. So thank you very much for your interest and engagement in this budget process. I recognize how very challenging it all is. These are hard conversations to have as a community, and I just really want to ask everybody to, I know you are all going to be very respectful, but we recognize how challenging this is, and so we just want to be gentle with each other and ourselves. Yeah, Secretary Treasurer Morris, thank you so much. I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so I want to welcome you to the budget information meeting tonight, and really appreciate all the feedback we've received so far. Definitely a strong theme, and a couple of other strong themes starting to develop as we move through our process. And I think it's important to remember that we are in the middle of a process, and that your feedback is certainly informing the final decision, which is by no means made yet. I believe so far on Zoom, I've seen Trustee Painter, Trustee Hensa, Trustee Whitaker, Trustee Ferris, Trustee Duncan, Trustee Leonard, and I'm assuming the other trustees are in the screen somewhere. So thank you to trustees. They've been working very hard, having several meetings and trying to gather as much information as they can. So huge kudos to the board, big decisions to be made, and lots of time commitment that they've been putting in, not to mention reading all of the feedback. So thank you to the trustees.
If I could just offer, Trustee McNally did send her regrets. She had every plan to be here tonight, but has had some family circumstances take over for her. She did say that she looks forward to following the entire video as soon as it's posted.
Great. Thank you, Trustee Painter. Okay, I'm going to go through a fairly lengthy PowerPoint, and I don't want to take up too much time because I do want to make sure we have time for questions, but I want to give good context for people who aren't familiar with the budget process, and I want to be able to speak to some of the things in the budget and why we are considering them, and also to make sure, as I said, we have enough time for you. And we're going to try to stick to, I think, an 8 o'clock close tonight. And so we'll get on with it. So I'm going to go through some of these slides very quickly, and the purpose of putting them all in one place was to post them on the web so that they are available for further viewing later. So I won't go in depth into each slide. So we're going to have a presentation and then a question and answer. And thank you, Jordan, for your opening remarks. And we'll hear from the superintendent at the end. Whenever we're talking about budget, we are opening with this slide in terms of alignment. And you'll hear a little bit more about this in a bit. We move from our strategic plan to our board work plan, to our district operational plan, to our school growth plans. And that's where resource alignment comes in, and that's where we are at this point in our year. And based on how we align our resources leads to student success and fulfills the strat plan. And so the cycle continues. So that alignment is something that we are always conscious of. Back in 2020, 2021, we started to talk about some shift that needed to occur, and then COVID hit. And so here we are in 21, 22, hopefully seeing the end of COVID eventually. And how do we need to shift? We're in year 2 of 5 of our collective agreements. We are, our strategic plan. And we are trying to live within our means sooner than later, unfortunately. We have a larger focus on data, initiatives focus, return on investment. Here, we're moving from a rollover budget to what's your plan? What are your initiatives in the upcoming year? That alignment that I spoke about, and ultimately improve student success. Just a quick backgrounder here. Here's a picture of our enrollment since 2013-14 and some basic allocation amounts in our operating grant provided by the ministry. What I really want to point out is 1920 is pre-COVID, well, 7 months of it is, and 2021 is our COVID year, and we've lost over 300 students out of our operating grant during that time. This does not include international enrollment. And we further expect to lose about 30 students based on our preliminary projections, which we are always monitoring. And schools are working hard right now to produce enrollment updates, and we update enrollment throughout the spring. So we keep an eye on that in terms of our budget as well. This is our operating revenue for the past few years. We have a couple of sources of revenue. Operating grant is in the blue, obviously the biggest part of our revenue. Operating other, we have our special purpose in green, which is restricted either internally or by the ministry. And we have our capital funding. In terms of operating expenses, we look at our operating expenses in 4 different categories: instruction, administration, operations, and transportation. And this graph just gives you a little indication of where we spend most of our money and on what. So thankfully, and as all school districts do, the largest chunk is instruction at 84.5%. We have a very small transportation department, which is 0.6% of our operating budget. And so in terms of looking at it a different way, we pay people a lot of, most of our budget is paying people wages and benefits. And this is a pictorial for you for your information. And services and supplies are 9%. So when we're talking about big swings in revenue or having to make some difficult decisions, wherever we're increasing enrollment and adding revenue to the district, we're increasing wages and benefits. And in times of constraint where we are reducing or having less revenue, we have to impact wages and benefits as well, just given the magnitude of the proportion of the budget that they take on. In terms of those wages that we pay, this is a breakdown of the types of employees that we pay. So of the total wages, we pay teachers 58%, principals 9%, education assistants 12%, support staff like our grounds crew, our carpenters, our tradespeople, etc. 12% excluded in the board, 3%, and substitutes 5%. I always like to do this slide just to see how we stack up provincially. So the province does produce School District 99 provincial bottom line. So in terms of that expenditure on instructions, School District 61 spends about 84.1%, and the province as a whole spends about 82.7%. We spend a bit less on administration than the average school district in BC. We spend a little bit more on operations, and this is due to the aging infrastructure and the number of heritage buildings we have and the number of schools we have. We only have a very small transportation department, and so we are able to spend more in the instruction area because I think we spend less in the transportation area than other school districts. And so that's a good news story for us. In terms of surplus, we've heard a lot about surplus over the last couple of days and weeks, and we'll talk a little bit about surplus here today. The left-hand graph is just a picture of the, at this time of year, what we intend to balance next year's budget with. And so really what we're saying here is that, and you've heard this and you've read it and you've asked lots of questions about it, is that our district tends to balance next year's budget with this year's surplus. And that's worked well for a long time in terms of having that leftover budget. What we really tried to do this year is make sure that we weren't giving carry forwards like we had been in the past, and that we were really trying to focus in on those learners that weren't succeeding as well as they could be. We also have to remember in 1920, for the last 3 months of the school year, we were in full COVID, no students in session, and only 50%, I believe, back in June. And we had, because COVID was so unknown and we didn't know what was going on with enrollment or funding, we had to put a spending freeze on from April to June. So our surplus was higher than even we expected by the end of that year. The main point here is that we do use a lot of surplus to balance next year's budget, and we don't hold a lot of reserve in terms of that rainy day fund. So we don't hold 1% of our operating grant as a reserve. We do have a surplus policy that says we can hold up to 4.5% of our operating grant in reserve, and we don't really do that. We do have some capital reserves, but in operating, we don't hold a reserve. So we ask ourselves a question, what about that rainy day like COVID? I could add to this list. Inclusion, when we have more students come between October and June after our funding occurs on September 30th. We're undergoing major capital upgrades and navigating increasing enrollment. Do we put aside some surplus to try to outfit those schools as they come on board after construction? And do we just simply save for a rainy day? This is another piece of data for you in terms of what are the surpluses at the end of the year and where do they come from, or how do we allocate them? So we have 47 schools, and they all have district allocation budgets from the board office, and we allow them to carry forward. We don't necessarily claw back from them unless they're in excess of the board's policy of 80,000 at secondary and 40,000 at middle and elementary. You can see we've made a policy change and really been encouraging schools to spend, and you can see how they've done a good job over time in bringing down those balances. And our mantra is spend this year's money on this year's students. And so they're starting to do that. But this is unspent schools money is money we allow them to carry forward. We don't claw it back. And we let them use that for their own planning going forward. Unspent district, these are some of the departments that Tolmi and Cecilia, learning team, inclusion, finance, facilities, those kinds of things. Sometimes these are contractual and sometimes they are not. And they are generally carry forwards. Perhaps a school has a project they want to carry on with, and we've put aside that money for them. We could be using it for wages and benefits, which is not a great idea. We should be using surplus for one-time funding, not ongoing costs of operating business day to day. Purchase order commitments. These are orders that are in at the end of the year, but not paid for yet. So they are committed. So we can't really use those for anything else. Last year, we set up a COVID contingency because, again, we didn't know what that revenue was going to do or how our enrollments would come in. So by the time we were here in each of these years, at this point in the year, by March or April, we had committed this much surplus in this column to next year's budget. So last year at this time, we had committed $7 million toward the 2021 school year. We left 30,000 unrestricted, and we had a total of $18 million in surplus. By the time we got to year end, which is over here on the right-hand side, we had adjustments for our amended budget. And so this is where we start to take in at the end of the year, we've got surplus, where are we going to allocate it? And this went toward things like some wage increases, as well as completing Lansdowne North opened, or South, at Richmond School. And so some additional monies were carried forward for the 2021 school year. And so the actual budget used and amended was $10 million. Here we are at this point in our year, we're estimating that schools will have $1.7 million left at the end of the year, that we will still have roughly the $500,000 in purchase order commitments. We are anticipating about a $3.7 million surplus, plus $1 million of benefits that we're withdrawing as a one-time funding injection. And so our budgeted surplus at this point is about $7 million. And that is fully incorporated into the draft 3 of the budget that we're talking about today. Again, just another way to look at our surplus and compare it to 18-19. Again, these school carry forwards are here. We did carry forward some money for international student program, which we are trying to reduce over time. Continuing ed, there are the purchase order commitments that you see, the department carry forwards of 5.2, our COVID contingency, and then just to point out over here on the right-hand side, in 18-19, at year end, we had committed roughly $5 or $6, $7 million toward the 19-20 and 2021 school years. And again, the board further committed by year end in its surplus appropriation last year. Just to be mindful that we have special purpose funds that are restricted. So these aren't in the operating grant. These are special purpose. They can be internally restricted or externally restricted. And what this means is we can't use them for operating expenditures. So while we have money here and we try to be creative with how we use that money, and we'll talk a little bit about Community Link, we are pretty restricted in how we can use these monies. And I know this was something that came up last year from this slide. So just a little bit of an explanation of what some of the acronyms are for your own information. We also hear about capital. Why can't we use the proceeds from Lansdowne to pay or cover the deficit? In our local capital, we have 2 kinds of capital. We have local capital and shared capital. The purpose is similar for both. They have to be spent on items that are over $5,000. Our general use in our school district varies a little bit between the two. We tend to use local capital for a few more minor projects and more equipment and hardware and furniture and vehicles, whereas our shared capital we tend to use for major capital upgrades, especially where we choose a more expensive option than the Ministry of Education suggests or offers us funding for. When we sell a piece of property in general, unless we can prove the money was gifted to us or we purchased it outright 100% with no ministry help, generally this is the breakdown. If you received $1 million, $250,000 will go into your local capital and $750,000 will go into your own bank account under shared capital. So it doesn't sit somewhere else in the ministry or anything like that. It does sit with us, but there are triggers to spending. So staff can't spend local capital money on things that aren't already approved by board motion. And similarly, shared capital can't be spent without board motion and the ministry's approval. And so this is where the ministry really tries to keep us on track in terms of trying to contribute to some of those major capital projects. And the ability to spend either of these on operating expenses is a no. Our capital planning principles are to attend to enrollment and capacity. What is the existing building condition? Our climate and energy efficiency, the funding categories available to us, and student transportation is also a capital planning principle in terms of school buses. Just to give you an idea of what's on our capital plan last June for the upcoming capital year, it's always done a year in advance. Additions to Sundance and Lansdowne, New schools is a site acquisition and elementary school in the Vic High catchment. Seismic is Cedar Hill replacement and shoreline upgrade. Building envelope program. This is a bit more of minor capital, but not enough to be funded out of annual facilities grant. Lambert Park and Mount Doug. School enhancement program, Vic High Mechanical. We're trying to leverage the fact that we have a major capital project going on there to increase the improvements to that building by using some of these other funding pots. And South Park roof replacement. Carbon neutral projects, Spectrum boiler and Doncaster air handling. Playgrounds that were a priority on the list last year for the upcoming capital year in Northridge and Lake Hill. So it gives you an idea of some of the funding categories and some of the priorities that were on the capital plan. So that gives you a very big, broad overview of operating, special purpose, and capital. But what we really want to make sure that we understand and that you understand is our purpose in school districts in the province. Each year or the turning over of a new government, the Premier gives a mandate to all ministries. And in this, in November's mandate were these 4 items: reconciliation, equity, climate change, and the economy. What was the mandate that the Premier gave to our Minister of Education? Continuation of education during COVID, improvements to online and remote learning, childcare brought into the broader learning environment, meaning school districts, and by 2023, universal access to before and after school care, and continuing seismic and requirements or capital upgrades and climate change and energy efficiency standards. We are to put more work into Indigenous languages. We are to invest and focus on mental health supports for students and staff. We are to create more local meal programs and provide safe and accessible playgrounds. We are to attend to the fees or the out-of-pocket expenses that parents have in terms of supplies and that teachers don't have to put into their classrooms. And we are to support the work of the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions in terms of dedicated mental health teams. So you can see some themes here in the mandate from the Premier to the Minister of Education. Now, what did the Minister of Education say to school districts? Boards of education will set, create, and maintain a strategic plan, and we will annually report on student outcomes. And we'll put systems in place to continuously improve the educational outcomes for all students and improve equity for Indigenous, children and youth in care, and students with disability or diverse abilities. This is paramount to us and has been made clear to us in this mandate. The ministry to school districts. Within that strategic plan, we have to report out, and our measures should be specific, meaningful, measurable, and evidence informed. The focus of planning and reporting is to understand the evidence and develop and implement actions to improve student outcomes. And so I think this is a very important thing to speak to because we have to understand the evidence, and that evidence could change as we're putting initiatives into place that work or don't work, and develop and implement actions to improve student outcomes. And this really speaks to those initiatives and looking at data and making sure we're nimble enough to respond to what our data tells us in terms of, and it speaks to budget and resource alignment a little bit in terms of we can't simply do a rollover. We must examine our line items every year and align them to what our data tells us we need to do for our students. The strategic plan can be found here. We have 3 overarching goals with strategies below them. We want to support and improve all learners' personal and academic success. We want to support Indigenous learners' personal and academic success and create learning environments that support learners' physical and mental well-being. And the overarching theme in the entire strategic plan is inclusive and culturally responsive. And that speaks to reconciliation and that mandate from the Premier to the Minister to us. And so if we are to examine our data, what does it tell us? Our EDI data is displayed here in one slide, and this report is on our website. We noticed that 2 communities have a meaningful increase in vulnerability, Burnside and View Royal. So if we know this about our students entering kindergarten, we need to align our resources to the learning needs of those early learners. What does grade 4 reading tell us? We have very low participation rates. So we use the data, and this data is used as a trajectory to graduation. And so it is difficult when we have low participation rates. But the majority of our students perform at a higher rate. Students with the ministry designation perform lower, and Indigenous students, even at a young age, perform at a rate significantly lower than students without a ministry designation. So we need to provide comprehensive balanced literacy supports to meet the needs of all these students. Indigenous learners. So here's a picture of our completion rates in School District 61. And our BC residents are over here. In the gray is where typical school districts in BC would sit. And we sit well within that, let's call it an average or that frame. The orange line is our trajectory through time. Where have we been and where have we gotten to? So overall, for BC residents, our results are good. They're within the range of the province in gray, and they're moving forward. They're not back here, they're moving forward. They're at the end or the right-hand side. Special needs, again, we're within the gray, we're nearing the top of the gray, and we're moving forward. Where do we notice Indigenous students? We are not in the gray, so we are not anywhere in the range of where other BC school districts are. This is our line, our results over time, and we are not moving forward here. We have moved back. And so this is a particular focus for the board and for us as a team in terms of meeting student need. Mental health survey. This is a fairly interesting set of data to look at, and requires more explanation in the next slide. Just note all the red numbers and the green number and one black number over here. So this data tells us that in grade 3 and 4, 40% of students are learning to care for their mental health, and this is above the provincial average. In all other categories, grade 7, grade 10, and grade 12, the various percentages of students are learning about their mental health, and we are below the provincial average. So this is through the mandate and also through our data, another area of focus. And we note in this data that participation and the results decline over time. So as a student gets older, they feel like they're learning less about their mental health. We are seeing improvement at the grade 3-4 level, as we could see in green, but deeper implementation is required at all levels. And again, that's a focus for us in School District 61 and needs to be attended to. So how do we align with the strategic plan in terms of some of these mandates? Mental health in the budget right now, we spend out of the operating grant about 112 and 260 out of Community Link. Physical health is 50,000 out of Community Link, and children and youth in care 110,000 for a total of 533 for something clearly stated in the mandate. This is a slide that was given to us in the first working session by the learning team, and it's a great example of how we are trying to attend to pre-K to post-secondary, so early learning to post-secondary. What I really want to point out, I'm not going to speak to this because I'm not the expert here, but we're really trying to look at and focus on and invest in and understand where our supports are for all students. Should most of our money be going for all students? Some need more support than others, and a few need very targeted supports. And so this, I think, is a really good philosophy or a way of looking at our data and our students in terms of equity and why some need more than others, and how we attend to that. I'm sure you have all pored over the April 13th budget presentation, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but I do want to hit a couple of highlights. And if you are new to this process, I hope you can ask a question later if you'd like. But really what we did in the budget was we tried to align to the learning needs of our students through strategic plan, operational plan, and school growth plan, and we tried to live within our means and move toward that ideal state where we're not using surplus to pay our bills, but using surplus for one-time big purchases that we don't depend on from year to year. We've had a reliance on unspent funds. We've had initiatives become ingrained over time without really looking at them from year to year because there's always been enough money. Our students are doing very well, but as we've shown you, some key indicators highlight where we've not moved our results over time. And even in times of constraint, we must focus on that mandate and our strategic plan in order to move forward. The assumptions in the budget are the numbers will change between start to finish and draft to draft, and we're not finished yet. We won't be finished until May 17th. In this budget, the deficit is covered, savings are identified, reinvestment is identified, and surplus is projected, and the budget is balanced. And that is for consideration. In operating, the yellow is new since the last draft of the budget. And so the bottom line here is that we have $3.7 million in surplus. We added a benefits payout, which is a one-time injection. And we have had some increases in staffing and some decreases in revenue. And therefore, speaking back to the way we spend our money or those percentages of how we expend operating budgets, lots of the balancing strategies here came from wages and benefits. So again, a decrease in revenue of 3.6 million and an increase in expense of 3.4 leaves us a deficit of 7.1. The color coding on these next slides is blue is a savings and red is a reinvestment where we've added back into the budget. The balancing strategies are considerations. The board is deliberating them now, and that's why we're here, trying to get feedback. And they are totally open to feedback before decisions are made, and people have been very vocal, and it's been very helpful. Administration, again, we pay for 0.1 vice principal admin time out of surplus for elementary usually each year. We tried to build that into the preliminary budget, but have now removed it, and also reduced by 0.1 FTE at middle and secondary schools as well. The board office, we've proposed a clerical reduction and an increase of a QP position at Tolme for the communications department. Careers and Pathways had a contingency in draft 2 of the budget, and we've now absorbed that into the balancing strategy, and there's no impact on staffing for that. Clerical in schools, schools are allocated clerical time and school assistant time, for which they use this time in a variety of ways. We've combined those two and reduced by about 10 FTE clerical, and combined the school assistant and school clerical allocation to give principals as much flexibility as possible in terms of staffing what they need for their school in the upcoming year. We shifted costs from operating to Community Link for 5 counselors. So we have maintained the same number of counselors this year by moving a funding source to Community Link. In terms of the district team here at Tolme, we had some rollover items in our budget that we had not looked at for some time and did take a look at this year. The first one is collab time, which is normally TTOC, if any, staffing. Enhanced learning grants, One Learning Community, learning support, and eco rowing. So these are rollover budgets that have been going on for years. And so we took a look at them and said, is that where we need to invest our money at this point? Facilities, we've tasked our energy manager, paid for through annual facilities grant, not operating, and a BC Hydro grant to find $150,000 savings in our energy efficiency over the next year. And COVID contingency, we will not have any provincial or federal money for next year, nor can we carry it forward. And so we have a small contingency for custodial or COVID, other COVID pressures. Finance is similar to withdrawing the benefit one-time payment from our reserve with our benefit carriers. We are proposing a benefit premium holiday to reduce the benefits expense, and that adds to $300,000 to our budget. In inclusion, this will be a topic for discussion, our education staffing assistant adjustment of 700. What the impact of that is on staffing is to be determined. We also took a look at gifted supports and removed those with the school-based team and the principal and the classroom teachers all working together to attend to gifted students, and the proposed reduction of 1 EA at Victor School. Just to give you an idea of what inclusion looks like in School District 61 over time, the blue line is our total inclusion students, including students that may not necessarily have a designation, but that require supports. And so we know that the level 1, 2, 3 funding for special needs is a funding model, not a spending model. And so we spend more than we are funded for. And we do provide supports to students who are not necessarily identified as a ministry designation. And so moving from 2014 at the bottom up to 2021, you can see the impact on the number of inclusion students we have and the number of education assistants that we have. International, we changed the ratio for which secondary schools will be staffed based on a 20.5 to 1 ratio, which is our average ratio from grade 8 to 12 in our district. Literacy, we're proposing to not renew the Reading Recovery Coordinator contract and not to provide the district staffing portion for reading recovery, and we've redeployed that to other teacher staffing to maintain our collective agreement ratios. We are proposing in this budget to for strategic plan alignment, literacy K-5 balanced literacy support. And what is that? We know that schools use a variety of literacy strategies, and I've listed some here. If approved, schools will be canvassed to determine where they are in their K-5 continuum of literacy skills in the areas of K-1, grades 2 to 3, and grades 4 to 5. So think back to that reading slide when we looked at our data and we looked at those vulnerable neighborhoods and what we had to do for early learning. And this is really trying to focus in on that literacy for all. And this is year 1 of a multi-year approach. And this is in the FAQ if you want to take a look at this further. But that's what the balanced literacy is. And reading recovery, why not continue? It's important to note that schools have retained their staffing so they can spend their staffing that they did put toward reading recovery on a reading recovery-like program if they like. It really comes down to what we might call equity in terms of reading recovery being in 14 of 27 schools and attending to 90 out of 611 grade 1 students. We were contributing $421,000 to 14 schools and the reading recovery coordinator. So about a $500,000 investment to 14 schools. And we have 27 elementary schools, whereas the comprehensive literacy proposal will attend to all elementary schools and all K-5 students using the approaches that we've identified here. Music is a big one. This has been definitely the major theme of the feedback. And so the purpose of this slide was to put on the table everything that we spend from a district perspective on music. And it's a significant investment, as you can see here. And the initial add back was to middle school band at grade 8 and to add back some teachers to that. And we heard loud and clear the feelings about that. And so that's been super helpful. And the board is definitely taking that all into consideration. Music by school, we know this slide looks a little bit different than our other slide because this includes some prep time that is built into the collective agreement. So these FTEs are going to be a little bit higher, but it gives you an indication of what teacher FTE is in our schools. And just to give you an idea of school population and as a percentage of the total middle school population and the amount of staffing that goes toward band teachers as a percentage of middle school staffing. So again, does it speak to equity? Do schools take band in proportion to each other? It's just another way to look at the data. And then finally, this would have been this is in the first working session PowerPoint that is also posted to the web. And so we started to look at some of the other ways that could band be delivered in a more efficient way that might cost less money. Are we able to continue the investment of 1.5 million, or do we need to find new and creative ways to provide band? We definitely heard from secondary school bands about the trickle up. It's hard to have a robust band program at secondary without that foundation at middle. And so we're definitely listening. We know schools in the province offer rich band programs to students, and we are in constant discussion about what other model we could use. And so we're really putting our heads together with our principals, and a big thank you to them in terms of coming up with a creative solution. So this conversation is definitely not over. District programs, we had some traditional staffing, again, in a rollover kind of staffing budget for schools that used to have district programs for behavior or extra supports that don't house those programs anymore, yet the schools continued to receive the staffing. And so again, peeled back that layer and had a look and said that's no longer necessary because the program's not there at the school. Technology, we are proposing to reduce by one QP member. Because we received provincial and federal COVID money, we had a major injection of technology for student device replacement into the budget. And so we propose to forego next year's allocation for student devices because we feel like we've more than covered ourselves off this year for next year. And so we'll resume that replacement plan the year after in 22-23. We're proposing to provide teacher laptops for temporary appointments. We're trying to phase out our desktop computers in classrooms. And this would provide a temporary teacher who's filling in for a leave to have the appropriate tools to do the job. And of particular concern is our network infrastructure replacement plan. Director Canty, thank you very much, took a look at all of the switches and network infrastructure that we all depend on for business and for instruction in our schools, and took a look at the end of life over the next 5 years, and it's significant. And so it's going to be about $2.6 million over 5 years. And I think this speaks to where we do a rollover budget and don't examine our operation from year to year is really in that infrastructure space. Some of our buildings are in dire need of attention, which we've really been trying to attend to. And our technology is no different. It's a major pillar of what we do in terms of business and instruction and needs to be attended to. Here we start to talk about strategic plan alignment. And here are some of the initiatives that we want to attend to in terms of some of that data that we looked at. Learning series, wraparound supports for students, that early learning framework and Strong Start. We are not funded for the wage increases in Strong Start, and so we need to find that out of our operating grant if we were to continue to operate under the hours and service that we do. And then the October Pro D Day. Again, the slide shows some of the supports where most of the money is going to all students. Some need more than others, and a few need the most. Community Link, we're proposing to reduce youth and family counselor contracts by $300,000 and the food budget by $196,000, and a partial principal that gets coded to Link. And retain those 5 counselors so that we can keep the same number of counselors into 21-22. Draft 3 also includes some of these line items. We just wanted to point out where we had also looked and found sources of funding and incorporated them into draft 2 of the budget, draft 3, I mean. Rentals increase. This is a a combination of returning from COVID and perhaps increasing some of our third-party rentals for gyms and fields and things like that, as well as CSS rental of Brayfoot campus while they for their temporary school while they build their upgraded school. We did see an increase in international students coming for 21-22, and the net profit for that is 1.1, and that is embedded in the budget already. We had set up a reserve for ISP last year, and that has we've foregone that and put it into balancing the budget, so no reserve for ISP. There were a couple of old motions and carry forward money, one from 2016 and one from 2017 that we asked the board to rescind, and they did that so that that money could be unrestricted and put toward the deficit. We know we have some significant, when we talk about infrastructure, we had a shops audit and an action plan or recommendation plan after that. And we know we have a significant investment to make in our shops if they are to remain open and safe for students to use. And so we're proposing to put in the dust collection systems into minor capital. But when we took a look at minor capital in that 5-year plan, it means South Park roof would have to wait another year, et cetera, et cetera. It's all about choices. There isn't any more money. It's about where we need to make the investment and what are we going to take it from. We also know we have year 2 shop safety mitigation that we were planning to take to operating, to the budget process out of operating, but we've since moved that to annual facilities grant to free up operating funds. And again, that comes at an unintended consequence where something in annual facilities grant, like an upgrade to a room or window replacement or things like that, simply won't get done. What were the things that we considered but were not included? We talk every year about late French immersion, moving from 5 to 4 classes, depending on if the numbers strike us and we can reduce by a class. We could not this year based on the enrollment. We talked about elimination or reduction in daytime custodians, but with no COVID contingency and no provincial or federal money and COVID potentially continuing, we need to maintain as many hours as we can there. We talked about our small schools and do we need a vice principal in each small school? And so we will start that conversation this year, but in year 1, it's difficult to save money because there's usually notice and severance required. Even though we've had a reduction in vice principals in the budget this year, they've been redeployed to schools based on absences or retirements or leaves. And so there has been no severance paid this year. But it is a conversation we probably need to have. District education assistants are deployed from the district. And obviously we've heard this one lots too, a reduction in management staff. And again, under the same boat, not part of a collective agreement with layoff provisions, but notice of severance. So again, a discussion that will need to start in the upcoming year. And QB 382 reductions. We can see with our, we did not anticipate or contemplate any reductions in the facilities, grounds, or custodial realm due to the aging infrastructure and the state of our buildings and the fact that this is usually the first place positions are cut. So we're going to be doing a little bit more analysis on these staffing levels. And so these were not contemplated at this time. We tried not to ignore any line item that could be looked at, and that's difficult. And we can see the feedback and the reaction to doing that. And it's part of a process. It's difficult and it's not fun. And there's no comfort we're going to give you between now and the time we approve the budget, but it is part of a process, and I hope you'll hang in there with us and be patient. The board is listening, and we are working toward that decision time in terms of trying to come to some middle ground. We have to keep in mind that 7.1 is needed to balance this draft, but some of the balancing strategies are only one time. And some are ongoing. And so it's the ongoing ones we need to obviously carry on with. And the one time may lead us to looking for more balancing strategies in 22, 23 and onward. We do have a structural deficit. So next steps, obviously here we are. We're getting feedback on draft 3. The board's gathering information. We are continuing to monitor enrollment. Is it going up or is it going down? And if it's going up, is it significant enough to add back into the budget? We have to remember every time enrollment goes up, staffing usually needs to go up as well. So we have to continue to do that. We are monitoring our surplus, and we are reaching out to departments on an ongoing basis to say, where are you at? Where are you at? Where are you at? Are you going to have unspent money at the end of the year? And so we'll be updating you as we go through this process as well. We sent out very conservative spring staffing pack-ups to the schools, and they're working on those now. And the rationale there was that it's always easier to add back staff than to take it away. It's harder to move through the process and then lay off or reduce. It's always better if we can be conservative to start and then add back if we can. In terms of informing the board, we are extending our budget process to May 31st. We'll be providing thought exchange results at our board meeting on Monday. Any feedback's welcome anytime at budget@SD61. The board is working through its working sessions so that it can ask questions and gather more information in an informal and more in-depth way. And as we work through those, we'll try to post them on the web for you as well. Here we are today. Tomorrow you will start to see a prioritization survey come out. And so we want to know of the balancing strategies, those red and blue, what's acceptable and what's not, and in what order. We want you to help us prioritize or give us your opinion on prioritizing. On May 10th, we're hosting a special in-camera for our partners to talk to the board individually to say, what are the impacts of this budget and what does the board need to understand in order to make a decision. May 17th, we'll be welcoming presentations from stakeholders. This is BC PAC, our unions, nations, etc. And second reading debate and second and third readings should be passed on May 17th. How are we informing you? We're here tonight. We're asking you to participate in a survey. We're welcoming your written submissions and emailed submissions anytime. And we want you to come to regular committee and board meetings or watch them on YouTube. Second reading, we put second reading on the floor until May 17th, and May 17th is decision time. And so we have some time to monitor that enrollment surplus and to come to some solution on some of the things that may not be tenable for us in this budget. Again, key milestones, and I will leave it to Shelley to sort of close off the budget presentation, and then we can move into questions and answers.
Thank you, Kim. I'm going to just reiterate what she's articulated here in closing. This is extremely difficult, and certainly no one makes a choice to go into a budget deliberation scenario such as this. Nobody wants to make any of these cuts. And we absolutely value all of the programs, the teachers, the instructional components that we have. We have an amazing school district. And there are no easy choices in any of these pieces. The feedback is incredibly important, and I really appreciate the amount of people that have already emailed and sent in their thoughts and ideas, because those are the things that we need to be hearing. This is tough deliberations, and as Kim has articulated all the way through this presentation, there's going to be shifts and changes as we go along, and hopefully some of those will be very positive ones. Student enrollment going up is important for us, and we're watching and monitoring it very, very closely. Those are the kind of things that we can then look to putting money back into the budget and realigning some of these components. But nevertheless, the feedback is going to be critical. So once again, thank you, Kim, for the presentation. It is not an easy piece that we're going to do. Your voice is valuable. The trustees are doing a work above and beyond to be able to understand where we're at, listen and read all of the input that's going on. But in the end, it's going to be a difficult decision. And we're just hoping that as we fluidly can move through and align some of the things that you've said, some of those decisions won't be nearly as invasive as some of the people are feeling they currently are. So thanks, Kim. We will move into questions and comments, and I'm not sure who's leading that.
I think Andy's going to watch the chat or the hands up, I think. And Jordan, I don't know if you want to sort of move into chair, or if you want me to do it, or.
Do it if you want, but it's just as easy for me to let you.
Sure. So maybe Andy, I'll ask you, is there anybody with their hand up with a question as we move into the question and answer period?
Hi, Kim. We've just opened the chat up as well.
Great.
After the presentation. I do have a couple of questions that came through directly to myself as the host via chat. If it's okay to start with those. Glennis Webster asked, with the desire to focus more strongly on data and the strong body of research showing the positive impact of music programs on student mental health and student achievement, what data can the board point to demonstrate that removing music will not negatively impact student mental health and achievement?
Yeah.
If the board is truly committed to supporting student health and well-being, I would like to see an evidence-based justification for the decision to cut music programs, EA support, etc.
Yeah, I think, sorry, a bit of an echo. If I may, I think the board is not wanting to cut music. I think we put everything on the table that we could in terms of turning over those stones or peeling back those layers and really understanding what the organization is doing now, and to come up with a more efficient and creative solution to providing music. It's not a judgment call on it's not needed or it's not required or it doesn't help students. We know that it does. It's a matter of trying to find the best and most efficient way to deliver that and hold it up against all the other things that are incumbent on us to fulfill in the mandate. So a matter of prioritization and balance and equity, I would say.
Thank you, Kim. Jonathan also had a question via chat. Jonathan, I don't know whether you're still on the call and we're hoping to voice that verbally. Please unmute yourself and ask the question if so. I'm happy to ask that on your behalf. The question was, which positions account for the largest amount of the $7 million projected for staffing and wage increase?
You would have to look. I think as a percentage of workforce, QP 947 and teachers are most impacted, as well as principals in terms of a percentage of total employees. I believe that QP in terms of FTE is a higher impact than teachers, and then principals are lower. And then there are no reductions considered in this round for exempt staff because of the severance and notice period. And we were able to reduce the principals by moving them into positions that were vacant in schools. So no layoff and no severance there.
Thank you. And then we had just a point of clarification from Winona Waldron asking if you could please define exempt management.
Oh, sorry. Exempt in management are people who are not employed under a collective agreement and so would have a personal employment contract. So that would be superintendent, myself, director of facilities, director of information technology, superintendents, associate superintendents, etc. So people who are not under the collective agreement of GBTA, QP 947, 382, or ASA.
Thank you, Kim. I'm not seeing any hands up, but there are requests in the chat to be added to the speakers list. So let me go to the first request there.
So I'm not sure what we mean by the question, I think, is do we know how many students are lost due to follow up? And I'm sorry, I don't, I would need to understand what you mean by follow up. Sorry.
So, I mean, like you said, we have decreased enrollment. Are we also losing kids because of the pandemic in the last year? We see that in other countries. What do we see in Greater Victoria?
Yeah, so definitely from 1920 to 2021, we saw a loss of 300 students, over 300. And we've seen a reduction of a further 30 in our projections for 21-22. Now, as people are getting vaccinated throughout springtime, will that enrollment go up and parents and students are feeling less anxious and will come back to us? We're hoping so, and that's what we're trying to keep an eye on. But at the moment, we're down 330 students from before the pandemic.
So that's 330 that haven't necessarily de-enrolled. They're basically what I call lost to follow up.
Oh, okay, so I think we've got some added supports in this year in terms of some money from Link, I believe, Community Link, and the provincial and federal funding in terms of really trying to reach out to those families that we know haven't returned and trying to welcome them back or find out what it might take to bring them back or why they're not coming back. So we are trying to reach out to them to find out why they're not coming back. And we would really love to have all our students back, not just for fun, but we know that school is the best place for students of this age. So we're hoping that we get as much back as we can.
And that was my point. I actually drafted a letter to the board as well. So my point was really the changes that we're making are affecting students and they're affecting enrollment. We're losing kids just like out of schools. So it's to remove something like a music program is going to have major impacts, not only now, but over the life course.
Mm-hmm. It also begs the question, if some students are doing well in a remote situation, is it incumbent on us to look at our distributed learning program to bump that up as well? So that's another business model that we're looking at in terms of, are there some things from COVID that we should keep our students doing well in remote, and would we consider expanding our DL program? So those are some other choices as well.
And how will you inform that with data?
How will we inform that with data? I think we have quite a few students that have gone to DL in a neighboring district, and so we're in close talks with them about what their enrollment looks like and what their out of catchment enrollment looks like.
And I guess one last point before I stop taking over the whole conversation is, can we have a really clear idea of the numbers that we're talking about when we're supporting certain initiatives or investing in certain programs or aspects of programs? Particularly when we're looking at things like music programs. I know you did a distribution by schools and I really appreciate that. But when we're also talking about this program or that program, how, what percentage of students does that investment benefit? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. You can try.
Can I just, sorry to interrupt, but just because there's so many speakers, when you're speaking, can you say your name so I know who's talking? I can't find you on the screen. I would appreciate it.
Good point, Trustee Whitaker.
That was Leslie talking.
We have Deb G with their hand up, and then we can go to some more chat questions maybe.
Sure.
I am actually attending because of, the big discussion about the music, but there was a lot of great information. I know it's hard. I can't even fathom the decisions that you all have to go through to do the budget. But two areas that I worry about is the music, because I'm curious, do you look at points of the fact that how music actually can help students in the long haul, how it benefits with mental health and peer pressure and all the rest that, it helps with anxiety, depression, all that. So I know we have to look at the immediate dollars, but what about the long haul of how this is going? If you reduce it, how is it going to affect other areas of the education?
Yeah, I think we've received lots of great research from actually the feedback we've received. There's tons of research that people are sending us. So I know the trustees are going to be looking at that. And again, it's not a matter of wanting to get rid of music.
No,
it's the affordability of how to deliver it. And is there a more efficient and creative way to do it that could help us with our priorities around that mandate and some of the data that we see in mental health and things like that. So I think it's a good point, and I think we've been given lots of good research by the feedback.
Yeah, I totally get that. I just think I'm thinking outside the box is that you're going to have you won't, if you look in the future of how it affects things, then you actually will be saving money. Do you know where I'm coming from?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And the other, just one quick thing, and then I know you have lots of questions, is when you were talking about the reading program.
Yeah.
For the inclusion group and students with disabilities, the recovery reading program is what I'm trying to say. Sorry,
Yep.
try to recall. I'm curious why that's like why you decided that wasn't maybe. I know you said that you're doing it within the school, but again, my fear there would be that if you're going to get rid of something like that, and I'm talking from experience, is that, yeah, they have great staff, but sometimes those programs from outsourcing them are more beneficial to the student than what is in the school. Now, if there's another way to do it, that would be maybe something to look at, because sometimes the support staff have no clue on how to support a child. My son is now in going in grade 9, and we're only starting to figure out supports for him. Finally, the light bulbs have gone on thanks to the speech therapist and stuff like that. So again, just curious.
Mm-hmm.
And you guys are all doing a great job.
I think where we come from around the literacy piece is it basically, the first part of it originated from a board motion to the equity committee, asking the equity committee to pursue reading recovery for all schools, because we could definitely see that inequity there, right?
Yeah.
Certain number of schools, but not all elementary schools. And the results of that equity committee study are posted on the website under the budget. It's a literacy PowerPoint, and you're welcome to review that. And what the committee recommended back to the board was the $500,000 literacy. Now, we had hoped that that would be on top of reading recovery, but given budget constraints, we identified everything and made our recommendation in terms of the K-5 literacy for all to be added back, and it fit better with our policy or our philosophy on sort of greatest resources to all, that middle section where some other supports are needed, and the sort of that triangle that went up. And we will be able to provide that equity with the $500,000 to all schools. And so that's just a little bit of background about where it came and went from the board to committee and back to the board.
Thank you.
I received some direct messages as host, so Trustee Duncan was up there next.
Yeah, thanks very much, Andy, and thank you, Kim and Shelley. I find myself still having a number of questions, and so this is one of the other opportunities we have as members of the board to ask some questions. So I wondered if I could first start with a question around the extent to which the ministry has in fact committed to fund salary increases, and the extent to which we're still unclear at this point in our budget process on whether or not we've got all that allocation, all that funding rolled up into the block. So I wondered if you could clarify for me when we're going to get that clarity from the ministry, and if we're, what we're waiting on essentially, because presumably the ministry could very quickly indicate whether or not we've got full funding for the third year of the 2-2-2 mandate or not.
Right. So we know that boards in the province are having some issue, as evidenced by BCSTA's motion to the province. I did reach out to the ministry and did hear back that it would need some further delving if we were to pursue more funding for the collective agreement. So we'll start to, we've been working on it, but basically they said they believe that based on the collective agreements in each district, that the labor settlement funding or the funding of collective agreement increases has been covered in the operating grant. But we can see from a big drop in that revenue was we received $5 million in labor settlement funding last year as a separate line item, and we are just not seeing that reflected in the operating grant. So we'll have to get our ducks in a row in terms of calculations back to the ministry if we are to ask them to have a look at that. So we are working on it, Trustee Duncan, but there's no resolution to that yet.
Yeah, I guess, you know, from my perspective, obviously that's very, very key because we're talking about millions of dollars, and that's the kind of deficit that we're working to try to address. The other thing I just wanted to say,
clarification, our initial calculation is less than $1 million. So just, it's not millions for us. It would be less than $1 million. But it's still, right, it's still a balancing strategy that is very useful.
Yeah, and in terms of the effect it has on our education assistance, it's pretty much, my understanding is it's pretty much entirely the amount of the cut that we're proposing to that group of staff.
Yeah.
And so to me, it's a really, really essential piece. And so, you know, I'd be interested to know in what ways the board can support our staff in advocating to the ministry to get that clarity, because frankly, it's not particularly helpful that we don't have that clarity before we embark down this road and propose to cut that much from a group of staff.
Yeah.
Yes. The other thing I just wanted to ask quickly was around this local capital and what we could potentially spend the proceeds of a land sale on. And I'm looking at one of the recommendations, the savings and reinvestments on draft 3, in particular around teacher laptops and network infrastructure replacement. And I'm thinking, is there an opportunity here for us to look at our local capital as a potential place to fund that little over 600,000? Is it possible that we could be funding 606,000 and change from local capital, potentially from those proceeds of future land sales, rather than from what I understand here is proposed from operating?
Can you get into that? Can I please interrupt? I'm noticing that there's lots of questions and people are asking that they are likely not to get a turn. We are going to collect all your questions just in case you're wondering. And we have a Q&A on the website. So we will make sure that there's answers to all of them if you don't get an opportunity to ask it tonight. Sorry, Kim.
Oh,
I'd also like to ask that trustees, if we could prioritize hearing the public's questions. I think that would be helpful. Trustees are going to have lots of opportunities to ask these questions. So just want to make sure this is the public's, a key opportunity to hear from the public. So we want to make sure that we get to them. Thank you.
I suggest that we maybe extend our timeline here, folks, because we've only half an hour for the public to speak. So it might be useful to just, extend our timeline to give the public a little more chance to speak.
I would put the motion on the floor to extend the meeting till 8:15.
Trustees, this is not a
second
board meeting. This is a public information session. So we're going to follow our direction. If we need to do another one of these, we can certainly do that. But as the superintendent said, we're going to harvest all those questions from the chat, and all of them are going to be answered. So none of them are going to be lost. And that's why we want to make sure that we're taking the time to get all of the public's questions so that we can answer those. So just to be clear.
I can speak to that last question just quickly. Both of those items, Trustee Duncan, would qualify for local capital expenditure, so we could do that. I want to caution us that if we are using a finite one-time money so the teacher laptops may be, it's going to be part of an evergreen program if it goes into place. If we give them, then we need to replace them over time. And the network infrastructure is definitely a 5-year expenditure or investment of about that same amount to total 2.6. And so I just caution us using one-time money on things that are cost of doing business. And those are the kind of ongoing costs that I really think we need to get away from using one-time monies to pay for. I get what you're saying, and you're absolutely right, they would qualify. But if we get used to doing that and those reserves run out, then we're right back to this conversation about living within our means.
Kim, I think it'd be good to go to Paul Hill, who's had their hand up.
Sure.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. My question is, There was a statement made earlier that nobody chooses this process, but it appears that this was a choice to change the accounting practices. The accounting practices for many years have been to take the surplus and move it into the next year. And my question is, why now? Why do we want to save for a rainy day in the biggest rainy day we've ever experienced in the whole planet? And why so abruptly? Why is this not a gradual thing put together over time? Why is it right now?
Yeah. So a couple of things. I'll step back to April 2020 when we were in our budget process for 2021. It became apparent upon arrival in School District 61 that a lot of surplus was being used to balance a future year, and that probably needed to change because surplus doesn't last forever. I think we've been fortunate here. We also haven't necessarily budgeted in a way that is accurately reflecting our expenditures. We continue with a rollover budget and continue to underspend. So are we investing in the right places if we continue to have leftover money at the end of the year? So that's one thing. You could see right away when on arrival, there's a $7 million deficit or a structural deficit. The board is continuing to use between $4 and $7 million a year to balance the next year's budget, and that's fine while surplus is there. This year wasn't, while we had a good heads up, COVID came along and we decided to do a rollover budget as usual and not make any changes. So we would have liked to have started some of these conversations last spring in terms of trying to live within our means over a gradual amount of time and starting that conversation in a more gradual or gentle way. So, and in terms of saving for a rainy day now, when we've had the rainiest year we've ever had, I think the board basically did make an investment in a rainy day by not having the conversation last April and using the surplus to balance this year's budget. As we move into 2021 with still 300 students gone and another 30, the surpluses simply aren't there. The revenue stream is down by 3.5 million, and with the collective agreement increases, expenditures are up 3.5. And so surpluses are not what they were, and we have cost pressures on both the revenue and the expenditure side.
If we could jump to a question on direct message from Boom. What steps, if any, have been taken to request more funding from the government?
I think as the board moves through its process, it will need to decide what advocacy it wants to take, if any. If we move through the process with the feedback and monitoring enrollment and surplus and can't come to some reasonable landing spot by May 17th, it will be up to the board to decide how they want to advocate. For now, we know our operating grant looks about the same as every other year, except for that enrollment decline, and enrollment declines happen and increases happen from year to year. So there is nothing major that changed about the operating grant. We will pursue determining if the collective agreements were fully funded or not. Other than that, it will be up to the board how they want to advocate.
Thank you. And then one more direct message question, and we'll jump back to the hands up. How did you decide on the age cohorts that are affected? For example, why cut elementary and music programs versus high school music? Why consider cutting back on late French immersion versus early French immersion? Are you following the science as to what ages benefit the most?
Right. Late French immersion is simply enrollment, and they are numbers, I guess, based on our enrollment and where students are registering. It's always a constant review of what the numbers are, what the collective agreement language is, what class size should be, what composition should be. Are we running 18 divisions? Are we running 17 divisions? And we know we have 2 schools with late French immersion that each have a class that run at quite low numbers. And so depending on where those students are and where they could get absorbed back into another French or late French immersion program, there is some room to say we're going to run 4 classes this year and not 5. Whereas I think the other French immersion is more stable. It's this 5th class as we try to grow late French immersion, or as it grows itself, that sometimes the 2 classes are very small and could almost be 1. And then I did not write down the other part of that question, but I had an answer to it. Can you just repeat the first part?
How did you decide on the age cohorts that are affected?
Oh, right. So that's a good question, and I should have mentioned that. So the funding model that we have from the ministry is that elementary and middle school students are funded at 1.0 FTE. And so that's within the timetable, within the bookends of the day. Middle school students are funded. We know lots of music programs because we fund them to the tune of $1.5 million, run before school, after school, and during lunch, which is great. But we don't receive any extra funding for that. Whereas at secondary, a student can be funded for more than 1 FTE because the funding of a secondary student is course-based. So if you take 8 courses, you're 1.0 funding FTE at secondary school. If you take 12 courses, you're 1.5 funded. So if you take a class before school or at lunchtime or after school, it's claimed from the ministry and funded by the ministry. It's a little bit of a rub in terms of middle because it's by head count, and there's no other ability to create revenue from classes outside the timetable.
And if we could go to the first Jonathan with the hand up, Jonathan Faber.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, so I have a question about the alignment of the budget, or actually the budget process, with the strategic plan. So one of the goals in the strategic plan is to create a culturally responsive learning environment that will support Indigenous learners' personal and academic success. However, when I look at the budget process, I don't really see any scheduled consultations with Indigenous communities, with local First Nations. At least it's not labeled that way. I know there's opportunities for the public at large to consult, and yeah, and I think based on the mandate from the government, based on the strategic plan, and also based on the data you shared about Indigenous student outcomes in the school district, I think it's really, really critical that at this stage, when we're planning ahead, when we're making a budget, that we really prioritize Indigenous student outcomes, and we prioritize consultations with Indigenous communities. So my question really is whether you have provided for or collaborated, engaged with, consulted with local nations, with Indigenous educators, with Indigenous community leaders, elders. If you have, I would really like to know what their feedback is on the budget. Yeah, and I would really like to, yeah, to speak to that alignment with the budget and the strategic plan, especially.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I really welcome that question. I have reached out through the Indigenous Education Department, who has very strong relationships with the nations, to ask how the nations would like to consult. I do believe we've had one response in terms of that May 10th meeting, which is great. I know that our structures are our structures, and I think as we move through consultation and Lansdowne consultations coming up, definitely first thing through the filter is, have we notified the nations? Have we asked them how they want us to consult with them? Have we asked them how they want the process to go? So we do reach out. I would say that we've got some good conduit through the Indigenous Education Department, and we have had one response back around the May 10th meeting. And I await any kind of advice or guidance from the nations in terms of our process. And I know.
Have you had any input from any Indigenous communities, any elders? Have you had any input at all at this point in the budget process?
Not formally, no, but we have reached out.
Thank you for the straight answer.
You're welcome.
You know, we have, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe any of our school trustees are Indigenous. So if it's year after year, nine school trustees deciding the budget, the school district deciding the budget, and we're not actively consulting and inviting that kind of feedback from our Indigenous communities, it's no surprise to me that we're failing our Indigenous students.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's definitely something we would like to enhance and definitely get on the road. But we want to be careful, or I want to be careful, that I'm not imposing my process on the nations or our process on the nations, and really hoping they'll engage with us on how we can walk that path together and how they can inform us and guide us.
Thank you.
And if we could go to the next Jonathan in the queue, please.
That me?
That's yourself, sorry. Thank you.
There's lots of Jonathans. I'm just curious about when we looked at the information about where you get the information about how music programs are run in other districts. What districts did you get these from? And was it like, I think one of the lines that was spoken is that the information that was used stated that their middle school is closing down next year. So what middle schools or districts did you consult? Because we have no idea who they are or where that information came from.
Yeah, so I think the team is looking at, so one of the tools we use in budgeting, or I use, is what are other people doing, right? And so I'm part of an association called the BC Secretary Treasurers Association, or Business Officials Association. So we often put out to our listserv. I just built a Google Doc and said, can you tell me how if you're a middle school, can you tell me how you're delivering middle school music? And so you get what you get. You know, some people are really busy right now. You might get 60 responses to a question. You might get 10 responses to a question. So I can't really control that. And so I took what I was given, and I always mask the districts because I don't have their permission to use their data. I just do it as a, I kind of dip my toe in and say, I wonder what other people are doing. But I know the Harold Caldwell, who works with our middle school principals, I know the learning team is really looking to some neighboring districts and some bigger middle schools to see how they are doing it as well. So like I said, that conversation is definitely not over. And I know that Harold and team are working really hard to try to come to some solution.
So we aren't allowed to know what districts you consulted as far as how their music programs are run in the middle school model.
And not unless I reached out to ask them if I could use their data, but it's generally just to find out, it's not to say that's what we should be doing. It's
okay. All right. Thank you.
You're welcome.
We should probably jump back into the chat as well and kind of go backwards, back and forth. So how and when will the participation survey be distributed?
Yeah, so the participation survey will be posted on the web, and our communications manager, Lisa McPhail, will post it or promote it through social media. And so I would look for it on the website. We'll send it to our stakeholders. I'm not sure if we're planning to email out to all staff through our channels in email, or we haven't talked about that yet, but Lisa will guide us on that communication. But you can definitely look for it under the financial page or on the, that header on the main page to go there sometime tomorrow and find it. And it's going to be just an open link there.
And next question in chat, you mentioned you are speaking with principals about alternative methods for delivering music programs. Have you also approached music teachers? Music teachers are the experts in teaching music, a highly specialized field.
Mm-hmm. I'm not sure if we've done that, but that's a good question. I will write that down.
And then Deborah Swain next on the hands up queue.
Hello. I was just typing a question. I really feel that despite everything I've heard, this is not the year to go ahead with this change from our practices. I know Elaine and Tom will remember some of the deliberations that have gone on in the past when music was on the chopping block, and the public is not able to show you their passion. They're not able to communicate with you in an immediate way. So we're making this change where we're going to stop carrying forward a budget during a year of COVID. And I saw some other things in the chat that talked about that too. So music is something that's very, very important. Historically in our district, yes, but also to people now. And you're not hearing it. I know you're reading the emails, but I'm sorry, that does not compare to a packed board meeting with rooms having to be found elsewhere for people because they were so concerned. And I don't doubt that would happen now. And I know if you want to know what it was like, ask Tom and Elaine. The other thing I want to say is that some of the other things that are happening, I think if you're looking at Indigenous support, when you cut EAs, you cut support to all of the vulnerable students. You're not just looking at some, you're looking at everyone. And we know about that person that's important to a student, and particularly that connection that's so important to our Indigenous families, that it's very difficult as soon as you start pulling staff away. I'm a reading recovery teacher. Again, we would have been there with our students to show you what we do. So I just think, why are you doing this year during COVID? I don't think it's the human thing to be doing, particularly not if it's not an absolute necessity. If the government isn't telling you, we're going to fire all of the trustees if you don't take this seriously, then you don't have to do it this year. Give people a full year to talk to you about it. This has come on very quickly for everyone, and I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's right.
Yeah, I think it is a conversation we started last year and needed to continue this year. Given, I'll just say it again, given the revenue and the expense pressures, there may not be, or there is not, as far as we know so far, much of a choice in terms of what we're considering. But we are taking the feedback and having a look. And it's not a matter of saying, gee, I think because we didn't do it last year, we want to do it this year. Nobody wanted to do it in this kind of manner. But if simply the surplus and the revenue and the expense pressures are such that there isn't the same amount of surplus to use, then we do have to make some choices.
Next person with their hands up is Crystal, BC Pack.
Thanks. I just wanted to take a second and build on what Deb was saying, because I understand, Deb Swain, that the current middle school music program was introduced in the 1990s, so late 1990s, 1999, I believe. And it survived all those years of Liberal budget cuts, indicating that these projects are designed to be maximally efficient and cost effective. And I'm just wondering, has there been any changes to the funding model or otherwise that now renders these music programs or these programs less efficient? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, because I mean, trustees like Elaine and Tom must have been very brave through the 2000s to say no to cutting these programs, and they must, knowing how fiscally responsible they are, they must have had some pretty good reasons for that.
I think a couple of things have, well, many things have changed since 1999. And I would say the funding model changed in 2002. And it's changed, it hasn't changed since, and we are under some impression that the funding model review phase 2 may come into play. I would say the main thing that's happened is we have gone from year to year to year to year without really understanding what the line items are in our budget and taking a look at where our investment lies. And I would say what's becoming more apparent is that mandate. The minister is telling us, and our strategic plan is telling us, and our data is telling us that we need to refocus somewhat on some of those areas where students are not succeeding. And I think that's changed since 1999. I hadn't heard of a strategic plan until, you know, the mid 2015s or the 2010s. So I think there's more oversight on districts in terms of delivering results and focusing on data and making sure initiatives are aligned to the learning needs of students. So it's not to say music is not important or not just as important as it was in 1999, but what has changed is our obligation and our need and our want to reconcile with Indigenous and improve student learning for those students that aren't succeeding very well.
Next question in the chat. What ideas has the board considered to raise money and or end the reliance on international students? For example, special paid programming, leasing properties, and any others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we do try to lease as much property as we can. And, you know, I think you can see through the Lansdowne and the Braefoot idea with CSF is we're trying to try to cover off some of our capital costs with capital monies and through Vic High as well. Revenue generation, we do depend a lot on international, and it's been very good to us. But I do think we need to be holding a little bit of that reserve, that 1% of operating grant for these rainy days. And like somebody said, this is the rainiest year we've had. And the board did make that shift in its budget process last year to use surplus this year rather than start the conversation. So revenue generation always comes up during budget, especially during constraint. And so we're open to any ideas that you might have, but our properties are definitely one area where we look to that. This budget contemplates recovering about 50% of our lost rental revenue, which is, it's an amount, but it's not $1 million, that's for sure. And I think it's important that people understand, you know, you might see a lot of childcare studios going up and things like that and say, gee, we must be making lots of money from our rentals on childcare. But just so you know that we only charge cost recovery on that. And that's something that's already also coming down in the ministerial order around childcare. So while we do try to lease where we can, that fit within, you know, the guidelines of the board, it's not a major money maker for us, but it does contribute. I'd say the major thing that contributes to our bottom line is the international program. And how do we diversify that dependence or other revenue generation is a really good question.
And going back to the hands up queue, Rohan Gowda.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Kim, for taking my question. So earlier, this is something that seemed to have been not many people talking about, was that there was mention of a shift of 5 school counselors into the community link funding. And this move is made to make sure the district maintains the same number of school counselors next year, which I believe is very important. But it seems to be at the expense of youth and family counselors and a portion of the foods program.
Yeah.
So are YFCs and the lunch programs not as important to supporting the mental health and general well-being for our students and families?
Mm-hmm. I think, so again, very difficult conversations. I think the things contemplated in the line items were really everything we could think of. And we've let you know what we thought of but couldn't do this year, but are going to have conversations about. We tried to put everything on the table and do what we could this year and make that very transparent. It is not to say one thing is more important than another or has less value, but it does need to align to that strategic plan and that mandate. And so in order to maintain the number of counselors, we had to look elsewhere. And I think it's really good feedback that you're indicating that that's, and I think we've heard from some principals that the youth and family council workers are important as well, obviously. And so I do believe the food issue is something that we are looking at with schools in terms of their own donations as well. We're not sure the impact is going to be terribly negative there, but we can certainly make sure the board's updated on the consequence of that, or the unintended consequence of that. And what we've also tried to do is provide sort of that reduction in link to principals where they do have some flexibility about what type of services they will reduce. So it may not be youth and family council workers in all cases, but it will be in some.
Kim, at Craig Flower Elementary had information shared by direct message. Kim, I'm wondering whether you want to speak to that verbally, just because there was a lot of information you shared by direct message, and it was a question regarding the early learning budget. If not, we'll make sure that all the information is shared with the Secretary Treasurer and senior leadership team. Okay, Sally Murphy.
Yes, thank you for taking my question, and thank you for this evening. I just wanted to second what Deborah Swain was saying about how fast this has happened. In particular, if you're looking for creative ways to deliver music in a different way, but a creative way, you must involve the music teachers in the discussion. And right now, they have had, as all teachers and everybody has had, a terrible year. And they are blindsided by this. And right now they are scrambling because they don't even know if they're going to have jobs next year. So to suddenly say that you're looking for creative ways to deliver music, you need to involve your professional music teachers as well as principals and parents and students in order to make informed decisions that will have the most impact for our students. I don't think anything, personally, I don't think that we should be having this discussion right now about these cuts, because it's too fast, it's too soon, and the public cannot really respond with what this means. But I do know many students who are very, very upset because their programs that are so important to their mental health are going to be cut, or that they're afraid they're going to be cut. And so I think there must be more time taken for this discussion to happen in order for it really to be effective and for it to really fulfill the goals that we want for our students, which is for everyone to have the opportunity to have success in school, to feel that they belong, and to feel that they are supported in their mental health. And students have had a very, very difficult year with mental health, and music for many of them has been their saving grace. So I feel this should not be happening now, and that we need to take more time to consider the impact on our community and our students. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we have time for 3 more questions. The next question in the chat from Laura. I am still not clear on why there's such a significant deficit. Is this caused by loss of international student revenue due to COVID, or is it a change in accounting practices that's caused the deficit? I know you spoke to that earlier as well, Kim.
Yeah, I think it's a combination of 3 or 4 things. So the first thing is that the enrollment revenue is lower because of our enrollment. We are funded by student. So we're still down those 300 students from pre-COVID. And so our revenue is definitely down. The labor settlement funding that we were expecting did not materialize, and we're working on that. On the other, so that was and our rentals are down, and interest rates have dropped. And so our revenue stream is down $3.5 million from where it was this year in the rainy year. So while we've had a rainy year in 2021, the impact continues for 21-22. So $3 million down in revenue, and compounded by that, we have increased expenses on the collective agreement side. And that's why we have to sort of analyze why or if we were covered for the collective agreement. And we have the regular cost of the economy, or the cost of living, sort of in some of our services and supply line items like technology and things like that. Prices are going up. Compounded with that, we do not have the surplus that we will have had in previous years. And so we don't have as much money to put toward the next year's budget. But we are monitoring that. Like we said, we're monitoring our enrollment and we're monitoring our surplus. And so we have to remember we're in the middle of a process. We put a very conservative budget, balanced budget on the floor for the board to consider, and that's exactly what they're doing now. And trustees will need to listen closely, and we'll be need to updating you and the trustees all along the way as we move toward May 17th. So the conversation isn't over. But those are some of the really contributing factors, and the fact that we have not recovered 25% of our pre-COVID international enrollment either. So it's a ministry funded enrollment, international enrollment, and increased cost pressures and less surplus to use toward the next year.
And Karen, Campus View Pack asks, how many exempt staff does District 61 employ?
I think there are about 25. I can answer that question in FAQ if you like, but I think I just had a peek today and I think it's about, don't quote me, I think it's about 12 here at Tolme, and I think it's approximately the same or a few more at Cecilia in our facilities branch.
And final question, since revenue is contingent on enrollment, have you, sorry, this is Karen Manders asking this, have you considered the impact on enrollment of cutting middle school music? Many students have options for where to go to school. One neighboring school district offers music. I think that SD61's music programs are a selling feature that attracts students. And already I know families who are looking elsewhere to send kids due to this proposal.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think when we talk about revenue streams or how to attract students or how to retain staff and students, you know, we just have to look next door at sides to see where our distributed learning students go to. So I think there are all kinds of places where we are in direct competition with another school district just based on the services we offer. And so I think it's incumbent on us to look at all of those programs that we deliver and say, are we providing what we can in the best way we can with the best service and in alignment with the priorities and the students who are struggling. But it's a good point. Okay, I think, was that the last one, Andy?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. So I want to thank you for your questions, and we'll make sure we grab the chat so that we can round out our FAQ as we move to May 17th as well. I hope you'll continue to email budget at sd61.bc.ca and book in for our public meetings, and keep an eye on the FAQ and watch for the survey. And I don't know if Jordan, you want to say anything before we go, or Shelley? But thank you very much for your time tonight.
That's all I wanted to add to, and just recognize how challenging this is, especially in the midst of a pandemic and everything else that we've all been through over the last year. And so just really grateful for all of the thoughtful feedback that we've received and for the high level of engagement in this process. It really does help us as a board come to better decisions with kids at the center of everything we do. So thank you so much.
I too also want to thank people for coming out. It's a tough process for sure. I have really appreciated some of the ideas that have been in the chat. Those are incredibly helpful on guidance, ideas, and concepts for us to consider. So thank you for your evening. It's been great to have everybody here. We will leave this open for about 3 minutes. So if you didn't get a chance to put a question into the chat or a thought, then you can do that. But other than that, good night and feel free to step away. Thank you. I think most people's questions are in, so we'll say good night and close her down. Good night, everyone.